Thanks everybody for joining me. My name is Evan Radisic. I'm the Managing Director of the Cloud Software Association. Today we've got Ryan Lunka from Blended Edge joining us to take us through his process of running a successful integration strategy. Ryan is a former head of product at N-Channel, but he's actually moved on to his own thing and his own very successful practice, helping clients launch their own integration strategy. So we're going to have a discussion. We've got some slides, we've got a whiteboard, we've got a few kind of elements. The idea behind these is to not have Ryan just do a lecture, jump in there. It can be a little bit awkward with Zoom because there's no real way to kind of have normal cues. But so I'm going to hand it off to you, Ryan.
So I appreciate the introduction. Yeah, I'm the co-founder and CEO of Blended Edge. We're a pretty new company. We just got started here in Q3, but I've been doing software integration both for smaller businesses and all the way up to the enterprise for basically my whole career. And we sort of recognized two things were happening in the market that we want to take advantage of. One is that we're starting to see a shift from call it third-party iPaaS or third-party based integration into a more embedded integration model. And that's why you see, folks like Trade.io and Workato and a number of other the big players now have these what are called embedded integration frameworks. And we also started to recognize that there are some pretty significant gaps for software teams in how to do this, how to get through these integration projects, how to prioritize what integrations you would build when, all that sort of thing. So that's what we're here to solve. You can see I got contact information on here if you're interested in following us or tracking me down. If you're following me on LinkedIn, get prepared for quite a few tweets about the Browns, but we're 10-4 and that's how it's going to go. But we got some good content out there too. And I'm pretty active, or I try to stay kind of active on the CSA channel too. So if you ever want to just hit me up and say, hey, I'm there pretty often. Yeah, what I'm going to try to do is something I've never tried to do, which is do more of a free-form whiteboard session for this. I do have some content on here prepared, but I would love to try to tailor it to some of the pressing questions that you guys have. Does anybody want to throw one out at me or throw a couple things out at me that you really, really are hoping to hear from here that we can kind of seed the conversation with? Who will be so bold? All right, you're gonna make me start this without you, huh?
I bet
I have some questions from the members that no one wants to ask you, but I know people ask all the time. Cloud connectors or in-house or outsourcing. Don't ask Tom; he might have some opinions. But do you build them in-house or you outsource, and how? And you use a cloud connector. That's something that comes up a lot. And how do you prioritize is the other one that comes up like every week. Those are 2 questions.
Cool. Yeah. So we can take the entire session to answer that question. So I'm going to start with this guy. So the way we think about how, and I'm kind of tailoring this towards ISVs, because if you're a solution integrator, it's a little bit different of a story. If you're an iPaaS vendor, it's a little different story. And certainly if you're talking about like internal enterprise integration, it's a different story. But if you're an ISV, most of the time there's this kind of three-headed monster of roles that are primarily making the decisions about what integrations to build, when do you build them, how fast do you build them, how are you going to build them, et cetera. It's the head of product, the head of partnerships, and the head of engineering. Now, it's not exactly structured this way in every single company, but if you kind of simplify the personas, this is typically where I see that happening. And the key with making decisions like, are you going to build a connector yourself to whatever other system is out there? Are you going to partner with a third-party SI or iPaaS to effectively refer your customers over for that integration assistance? Are you going to embed some existing technology like an embedded iPaaS or an open source framework yourself into your product? Comes down to navigating the relationship here. So ultimately, these are all ROI based questions. So helping the head of product as a head of partnership understand like what's the return on investment or what's the intended return on investment for the integration you're talking about, how many more of them they have queued up behind behind the one request that you have. What's the sort of business strategy behind driving them? Helping the head of product prioritize that along with the all the other features that you want to build on your core product is pretty key. And then ultimately it's going to come usually to the engineering team or somewhere thereabouts to figure out how to get it done. So then it literally becomes an hours conversation. How many hours are we going to invest into this? How many hours are we going to invest into maintaining it, et cetera? And it's a fairly easy conversation when you're talking about one integration. But if your growth strategy, like most B2B SaaS companies or B2B software companies, is based on having more and more and more integrations, you actually have to think about this as a program over the long term, because it looks very different when you have 3 integrations from when you have 25 integrations from when you have 150 integrations. In terms of developing ROI, let's see, I have a little bit of this is not something that's all that new. ROI formulas are what they are. But there's some things about sort of deciding what your ROI is on an investment in a certain strategy. Again, are you going to invest the developer time and the basically the product dollars to build these things out yourself? Are you going to invest in a partner relationship that that brings these in for you? Are you going to buy some other piece of software that you embed in your product to do the integrations? You have to do sort of an overtime ROI calculation. And it's a little bit weird to do it, especially if you're a SaaS vendor, because you have to think about forward pulling revenue. So what I have here is what's the, how much revenue are you going to be able to bring in and how much revenue you're able to pull forward because you have an integration out faster. So that's important. So let's say with your current engineering team, if you're considering hiring somebody to build integrations for you, with your current engineering team and the current approach you have, you can build out one integration every 3 months. And every single time you build out one of those integrations, that unlocks some amount of revenue potential that you can now say yes to because they're going to come in. If you can find a way through third-party technology or through a new framework you're implementing or whatever to get those 4 integrations a year out in 4 straight months, because you have SaaS recurring revenue attached behind each one of those, you're actually pulling forward recurring revenue. So over time, the gains on what you're doing accelerate. On top of that, you might be also even reducing the amount of hours that you're putting into each integration if you're doing it more effectively. So thinking about that kind of investment and actually, netting that against what it actually costs to build and maintain the thing should be able to give you an ROI calculation. And you can sort of model these out, different approaches out to decide which one actually mathematically looks like it makes the most sense. Now that there's a lot of judgment in ROI models, but that's generally the way we start to think about deciding what the best approach for a software vendor is. Any thoughts on this? Has anybody tried to do a calculation like this or tried to make financial decisions about how they want to handle their integration strategy?
I think a key question is how do you implement and calculate revenue acceleration? But you might cover that later. But that I think is a question that came up in the previous talk.
How do you implement the revenue acceleration?
How do you calculate revenue acceleration? Like what is it? I think more specifically, technically, how do you actually implement that? Like what tools are you using?
Yeah.
Come up with
so you have to model it, right? So it's never perfect. It's always based on a whole bunch of assumptions about your business. I've typically done this, like a actually baked out version of this in Excel, or I use Google Sheets, but same thing. And a lot of what goes into the revenue acceleration is looking at your pipeline, looking at how many, what do you have in your pipeline currently that you can service with the integrations or lack thereof that you have. And then, if you say, if I had this integration, I have this many more leads times my close rate. And if I have this second integration, I have this many leads times my close rate. And really just stacking it up on itself and projecting it out. I usually do like 3 years to see if you're able to deliver those integrations to actually say yes to that revenue, what it looks like. So it's almost like you're building out a financial model for the business overall. You're just kind of focusing a little bit more on what if we build this integration and it's out on this date to then stack up the more revenue on top of it.
And here's the issue too, is like a lot of these, and I don't know if that's the case with, I think it is with a few people here, is that, you know, you're kind of bundling in, you know, this integration strategy, partnership piece of it with the revenue facing partnership distribution piece. So now you're talking about integrating with different, you know, tool sets to make your tool stickier, get new customers and do all that kind of stuff. And then creating this like distribution channel that's going direct to customer or direct to partner to customer. So it's kind of like two different hats you're constantly going back and forth on. And, you know, one feeds into the other. I don't know, like, has anybody in the audience, like, if you guys run into this where you're constantly having to switch hats between the two, kind of talking about integrations, talking about revenue? Like, are you talking engineering? Are you talking to, you know, your head of sales? Like, what's the division between those two groups? Jake, you're in this process now, aren't you? Oh, Jake's with us, or anybody else?
Hey, sorry about that. Yeah, I mean, for us, we historically have been product partnerships, integration, reduce churn, create a more stickier customer, add more feature capabilities to our product because we're in e-signature space. So naturally, our first partnerships are cloud storage, right? You know, documents signed and then automatically uploaded to your cloud storage of choice. Now, as we have a team, small team built out, we are not only looking for other partners to integrate with and drive, again, more of an integrated solution into their tech stack, but then also how can we squeeze you know, these new channels for potential revenue growth out of it as well. So we're literally going through that exercise, and that's part of us weighing our current integration strategy on kind of who to integrate with. You know, kind of prioritize is based on a number of those factors, but you know, weighing heavily on where could we open up new channels for additional revenue heading into 2021.
That's a big one, right? Like the fact that you're, you know, that decision of like, okay, we've got so many resources, and kind of going back to what you're saying, Ryan, is like you got so many resources, you can outsource, you don't have to, it's better to build in-house, but how many of those can you select? And what's that decision-making process of like, yes, we're going to build this, here's how we're going to build it, and here's why we're going to build it. And usually it's an easy decision when it's like, oh, if we build this integration, and I know Jake, we've got an exciting one coming first quarter of next year, but like, it's like, okay, we have this integration that's going to bring us X amount of customers because we know they're using our types of tools with that tool. So, but when it's not so clear, like what is your, like Ryan, do you have any like insight into like what's the baseline, you know, almost like checklist of like, do we build this? How much resources to put together? If you don't know the revenue clear as this formula is, like what is that like checklist, so to speak?
Yeah, I mean, I would argue you should know what the revenue impact is on a given integration, whether it's to bring in more revenue or it's to maintain revenue by reducing churn, making your customers more sticky or what have you. If you can't describe the unit economics of why you're going to potentially build an integration, you shouldn't be building it. I mean, you should be investing in it, just like any other product feature, frankly. I like using this 9-box prioritization matrix, though, as a way to sort of organize your thoughts around it. Because the challenge is it's not cut and dry the same way for every single software company. But if you look at impact relative to effort, and those are intentionally vague terms to use here because they, again, are different per company. So impact for one company might mean you know, making really, really sticky customers and retaining you know, more and more customers over time. And that's a really high impact. But for another company, high impact might actually be, oh, we're going to monetize these integrations. So there's like a direct correlation with revenue. And kind of thinking in these terms of what's the most bang we can get out of the least amount of effort, which equates to cost, helps you sort of think about where on this matrix, where all the different opportunities you have go, and then how can you start to break them down one by one to bite them off. Where like integration technology and stuff like that comes in, like how do you actually do it? Really, that's how do you reduce the effort? How do you make every single one of these easier so that you can get it into this highest priority part of the matrix?
I mean, this thing's actually
I
really
think
interesting.
one other.
Go ahead.
Sorry, Evan. I was going to add to that. So one formula that it's very basic that we found recently to be helpful for us to prioritize is we can all think of 15 different technology partners to integrate with or partner with. And quite frankly, I don't think anybody could support something like that, a massive list and kind of, prioritize and pick them off one by one. Rather, we're focusing on the top two, like biggest of that, particular partner list. If we're focusing on a certain industry, like CRM, for instance, we want to partner with the top two big guys. We understand that it's going to be a long tail approach, but in the end, there's going to be, high enough impact out of that to want to focus on those top two big technology partners. And then really focus on the bottom 5 of that 15 because they're smaller. You could probably bang out more of those and get more impact with many of the smaller opportunities and not really focus on the middle half, because that's where it's a blend of the two, where it could take extremely long and you might not see as much impact out of that middle group. So really for us, focusing on the top 2 and the bottom 5 as an approach we're going to take heading into this year.
I like that. There's a lot of opportunity to be found in the long tail, as long as you're able to execute on it in a way where you don't just like spin your costs out of control to go get that business. But yeah, the long tail of integration requests, and CRM is a great example because there's just so many freaking CRMs on the market. You basically can create these gaps in the market where there's no competition because nobody else integrates to those CRMs or those less common technologies. What do you guys? What kind of approach are you guys taking to build it out? Are you building it all out in-house?
Majority are in-house. We actually have a dedicated team to focus on API and platform integrations this year, 2021, and then Salesforce. I mean, working with a PDO is probably the best route to take for that. But mainly, it's all in-house.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's when the vendors get to a place where you can actually build that team in-house and they can be effective in building these things out. I see that quite a bit. Where this becomes a really big challenge is when they don't have the team in-house to do it, or they don't have the time to do it. And you have to start making these really big trade-off decisions between, do I build, this major feature that we wanted to have this year, or do I build a NetSuite integration, right? And then that's where they kind of start to get into some challenge.
Yeah, I think from the partnership side of things, what we're doing is building a pipeline of opportunity and realizing that, if we keep building that pipeline, we know that if we identify 5, most likely we will probably only do 2 for that quarter, and just kind of continue that process over the next, couple quarters, essentially.
That's a good segue, Jake. I know there's been some questions around like the team structure and how to, so like if you have a pipeline of say 5, 6, 10 that you've identified there, like, okay, these are our top 10 that we need to establish a relationship with, figure out who's building what, and kind of deploy over the next, whatever, 2, 3, 4 quarters. How do you structure your own kind of teams? Amir, I think you were going through this. How do you structure your internal teams, like between all the different departments to deploy that top 2 or 3? Like, how do you set it up for success? Like, are you working with engineering more so than product, or product engineering? Like, Ryan, is there anything on that point?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on the size of the company, right? So if you're just past a Series A, maybe you're a younger company, usually what you see is you have one engineering team that is kind of just doing all of the engineering, and there's maybe a product manager or a couple of product managers that are sort of prioritizing the work of what needs to get done for the product. And then really it's kind of a group trade-off conversation, right? And oftentimes the whole executive team in a company that size has input onto what's going to get built when, and that includes the integrations. So one, you want to have a clear understanding of what the business value is in those, because you're going to weigh it against the business value of features you're building internally. And then two, you always want to be thinking about, is there something we can do so that we can, if we have X amount of allocation for the integrations, we can use that to get 5 of them, not 3 of them. How can we do this more efficiently? When you start to get, a little bit bigger, you eventually have to make that decision. Are you going to invest in building your own integration team because it makes sense to have your own integration engineering sub team, or are you just going to kind of partner out with that and kind of keep that at arm's length? And honestly, I think the biggest driver in the decision there has to be really what the enterprise value of the company is, and is it tied to having ownership of that part of it? Most people in this room are probably not working for an integration company. So if you're not working for an integration company, are you asking yourself the question about whether or not you actually want to build a team and spend, capital dollars on a team that builds integrations? Or do you want to have a team that's much lighter that supports somebody third party that does this for you? That's from an engineering perspective, typically how I see that go. And, probably you get to 20 or 30 people on your engineering team is when you have to start thinking about specializing.
Yeah, because that's a pretty big question right there, right? Is like, do you build an internal? And then I see this graph as being like something, almost a decision-making process on like, okay, we've got a partner that we want to integrate with. Who does what, right? Like, are we doing 50-50 deployment? Or are we building it out and you guys are just supporting us? Is it the other way around? So how do you do that dance of figuring out who's going to do how much, knowing the internal, resources that you have, right? It can be complicated.
Oh yeah, and nobody wants to build the integration. Like if you have 2 partners that are like talking to one another, everybody wants the other one to do it, right?
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
I mean, unless you're monetizing it yourself, or you are an integration company, like you are an iPaaS, and you're deciding, do I build another connector? Do I build another connector? That can be a weird conversation, and a lot of people just put up an API and think that that's adequate and that's enough that people can integrate to you, and it might be, but you're asking somebody else to do it.
That's an interesting comment when you said that. Sorry, Amir speaking here. That nobody actually wants to do the integration, but everybody wants to do the integration. In your time, have you come up? Is there a number in terms of percentages of how many companies you feel are outsourcing the integrations versus how many companies are trying to do it internally? And is there benefits and risk with each going either way?
I don't have hard percentages that I could give you. I can tell you I find far more people build the integrations themselves than outsource it in my experience. And I definitely have a strong belief that far more people are doing that than should be. I think so if you look at all the different ways you build a software application these days, you can do it on, call them SaaS building blocks or software building blocks. And they're things like Stripe. Like nobody here is gonna, unless you're a payment processor company, nobody here is gonna build a payment processor from scratch. You're gonna use Stripe, you're gonna use one of Stripe's competitors, something like that. Nobody's gonna build an email marketing application or an SMS marketing application themselves. They're gonna embed Twilio in their application. But for some reason, when product teams who aren't selling integration software get to the question of how do we do integration to other products, the default decision is usually to build them themselves. And that, I don't want to say it's 100%, but it's almost 100% from what I see in early stage companies. They start building them themselves, and until they get to about 5 or 10 integrations, maybe a dozen, depending on how complicated they are, they don't feel the pain of what they're actually building. So I would say if you are not an integration company, you should be intentionally skeptical about the decision to build your own integrations. And if you come to the conclusion that you should be doing it and there's business value for it, great. But I find that most software vendors just end up doing it because we need X, the development team says I can build X, so you build X.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I know in my previous life as well, it's like, it's always, you're right. Like I'm work with a few startups, and it's always, yes, we need this, let's build it, almost as if they're talking about a feature of their own product. Because I think it comes a little bit easier for partnership professionals to kind of wrap their head around what a relationship would work with an outside vendor to do it on your behalf. But kind of generally speaking, for the company, CEO or CEO or whatever, they look at it as like, it's almost like outsourcing a piece of work. It's like, it's too far away, we don't have any control, there's too many, they always think of the negatives around, like, why would we do that? That's, but is there anything that you can kind of, you would, if that was the case, if you knew that, is there anything you would put in front of them to kind of make the argument that, hey, you should consider an outside vendor, there's many of them, here's why, and here's how to select a good one that fits within your culture or goals, whatever the case is?
I do start with that, the ROI model for sure, because that is an important part of it. And if you're a CEO, especially if you're an investor-backed company, you should have a pretty good explanation for why every single one of those venture capital dollars are going to where they're going. And if you can't clearly articulate how dollars invested in building an integration team directly translate to the best possible outcome in terms of enterprise value, then you're not doing your job. So starting with that ROI model and thinking about what are you going to spend to build this team internally relative to the return, or what are you going to spend to do this externally with a variety of different options relative to the return. Because if it's an even return and one is half as much investment, then that's an easy answer. In terms of like finding the right partner and one that is culturally aligned, I don't really view it as any different than any other vendor selection, right? Obviously, if you're a marketing technology company and you partner with somebody who is specialized in integration for marketing technology, that's going to be kind of a better fit generally, all other things considered equal. Is it a company that culturally, like, you can have conversations with and like kind of buddy up with and work with? Because it is going to be a long-term relationship if you're going to outsource your integrations. And basically what you're saying is, hey, you third party out there, I'm putting my customers in your hands. So I need you to, behave in a way that is congruent with the way that our brand behaves with our customers and things like that. And for integration, that can be kind of tricky sometimes because it's such an engineering heavy discipline that you don't always get an integrator that talks to customers the same way. And that was a big challenge for, I had to manage our onboarding team at the last company I was at. And we worked a lot with Shopify merchants, for instance. And Shopify was far from our only integration, like our partnership that we did integrations for. But we had to be able to sort of, when we were behaving as a friend of Shopify, we had to behave as if we were Shopify, so to speak, which was very different than if we were behaving as if a friend for Magento or some of the other ecosystems that we provided integration for. So finding an integration provider that you're outsourcing to that can kind of chameleon a little bit to how you behave with your customers is important.
I had a question for you, Ryan.
Sure.
Jens van Dijk here. I'm on Jake's team at SignEasy, for anyone who doesn't know me. So kind of going back to the ROI, just curious to hear your thoughts on, do you feel like there's a difference typically in terms of what the revenue acceleration could look like when you're building your own integration versus when you're using an iPaaS system or a third-party integrator to build that out for you? And the reason I'm asking is, if you have a third-party integrator, perhaps the use case or the functionality of the integration might not be, the total package or as deeply integrated as when you're building your own. Just curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I'll put it into 3 buckets. There's, build it yourself. There is leverage a third-party iPaaS in a white label embedded fashion, which means you're paying somebody else for the technology, but you're still building it yourself on that technology. And then there's partner with an SI or an iPaaS to own a separate relationship to facilitate the integration itself, right? I think you're definitely right that in the third case there, where you're kind of leaving it up to the integrator as a totally third party, they are probably going to build as little as they have to get the business and get it done. And you may not have as sophisticated an integration unless you get to a point where you've got so much of these going, or so many of these integration projects going together, you've got some leverage to say, hey, let's continue to invest in this. And again, coming from somebody who used to run an iPaaS company, if you're in that role, your job is to build as little as you possibly can to get the revenue in the door. So you're not going to invest in the most amazing, sophisticated connector you can ever think of, because why would you? You don't need to. And a lot of times you'll just build reactively as the requirements come up. So when you're thinking about the experience and the integration capabilities you want to provide for your customer, that should be certainly part of the thought process. In terms of the other two options, build it yourself or build it on an embedded iPaaS, it really just comes down to how quickly can you build those, because the sooner you get them to market, the faster they're generating revenue for you or generating value for you, whatever that means. And again, I find that most vendors don't even consider the embedded iPaaS approach. And more than likely, you're going to be able to build integrations faster with a lower cost employee on an embedded iPaaS that has good capabilities than you are having your engineering team architect and build everything from scratch. I don't say it's a hard and fast rule, but I think that's probably generally going to be the case.
Yeah, I think that's awesome. I think that's a very interesting way to think about it, the three-prong approach, if you will. So yeah, appreciate that. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. This slide, so to speak, I have on my screen. This is another one that I like to use as like a very sort of fundamental thing to always have in your head when you're thinking about integration. And then actually, this goes back to a comment somebody said earlier. Literally nobody wants integration ever. Everybody hates it. It's not a thing that somebody wants. Even when a customer says, I want an integration, they don't actually want an integration. They just don't have a different vocabulary for telling you what they want. What they need, what they want is an inner product experience, right? So I'm a business user out in the world, and I've got, on average, 8 or more different technologies that I have to use in a given day on my just like doing my job kind of a thing. The extent to which those 8+ technologies that I have to work with play nicely together and give me a seamless, basically workflow through my day is all a win to me. So what I'm looking for when I'm asking you for an integration to some other software product is actually an inner product experience where your product and that product work seamlessly together as if they're one. And data integration, or you can even get deeper than just data integration, is really the technical glue that makes that happen, that complements the partner relationship from a business perspective. So do your salespeople, do your support people, do your implementation people behave as if they're one team? Like, are you aware of each other and what work you're doing for the joint customer? And then the same thing, once the software needs to reflect that same type of a relationship. So again, when you're considering things like, do I outsource this to somebody else? Do I build it myself? Who's going to build what on this? You want to always be looking back to this North Star of what is the inner product experience we're trying to create for our joint customer, and what is the best way to serve that need, obviously within the economic realities of what we're trying to do here. And so this is an example in this picture. This is, a partner and they have an integration, whether one builds it to the other or vice versa. When you think about what happens if you're going to bring a third party into the mix here, now this, your customer here has this other person in the middle here that they have to have a business relationship with, and you're thinking about how that complicates this. At a very simple level, you're going to say, we're friends, but if you want our software to have that inner product experience, you want our software to integrate for your use, you need to pay a bill to this other third party friend that we have here, and they'll take care of that for you. And that, just on the face value is already a little bit of a kind of a experience.
It absolutely is. It does usually come to that point where it's like, and I've been in that position where it's like, this is a very easy way for us to deploy these, I want to call them like micro integrations, where you can plug into these, I don't want to say obscure tools, but tools that you would never build an integration offer to all your customers.
Yeah.
Hey, work with this vendor. They're going to build it for you. They're going to charge you for just that plugin and away you go. But you do feel like you're just handing off a customer to be like, hey, like you can become a customer by like, go pay these guys first and then come back to us. So it does feel icky. Like, have you seen anything done well in that type of arrangement? Like where like it just works well and it doesn't feel that icky? Like,
can I comment on that?
Yeah, Tom.
Yeah, so there's a ton of data about the lack or the disinterest of B2B SaaS customers wanting to pay more for integrations. And our friends at Profitwell have done a pretty exhaustive study on that, the willingness to pay. And their conclusion is that B2B software purchasers would much rather just pay more for your product and make sure that you're owning and having responsibility for the integration than having to go to a marketplace and pay a third party. And that sounds really smart until you look at the App Exchange and its growth and its unbelievable success doing exactly what the Profitwell data would suggest customers don't want, which is creating this sort of like off the shelf, buy it and make it somebody else's responsibility integration directory. And as a company that builds stuff for Salesforce and we build integrations on all these different platforms, I'm a little conflicted about it because as a buyer, I much prefer the native integration built into the fee and sort of have an expectation of it. But I can't argue that there are people buying integrations from third parties all the time. That's being very successful. I'm part of a network for Thomson Reuters that just launched one where every single integration is going to basically cost 15% more because it's going through this app store. And I think of that and go, that would really frustrate me if I subscribe to that software. But obviously people want it. People got to get paid. So I would love to hear what Ryan thinks about that, pull on that strand.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I don't know, I haven't got my head around exactly how to think through this or articulate it yet, but your integration strategy at your early growth stage and your integration strategy once you've got the critical mass of customers to where you start to become a hub of your domain are very, very different. So like it's going to be hard if you've got 100 customers to put up an app marketplace and dominate the industry and just obligate people to buy things from your app marketplace because you said they have to do it, versus Shopify or HubSpot or Salesforce has an app marketplace, and that's kind of the gateway to getting that. That's the only place you can go to have these sort of app integrations, and they're able to kind of just set the rules because of that. In like in any given software ecosystem, it's really a race to be one of those, and there's only going to be a couple of them. So who's going to get there first, so that you can grow to that place. I'm not going to begin to be able to explain the irrationality of consumer behavior about why the data says one thing but they'll do another. But I think there's something to understanding where you are in that trajectory toward becoming as close as you're ever going to become to like a hub technology in your ecosystem, and just understanding your role and what how much of the rules do you get to set at what point in time.
Yeah, I think it becomes more and more, it's a lot more complicated for different reasons when you're early in your journey integration strategy than when you are in the latter, because usually in the beginning sides, you're under resourced for what you need to do. And you're making the arguments of like, oh, we need to build this and because there's this revenue potential, or we need a team member, or we need a whole team to do this because here's the revenue potential. So you're constantly arguing what the value of investing in an integration strategy is, versus when it's like clear as day, then it's just about scale and like figuring out like, how many of these build, how to structure all that stuff. Again, equally complex, different things. But I think majority of people here are in that first part of it. It's like, how do we structure and argue for an integration strategy, and what does that look like? So I think the root of that is like, how do you articulate that ROI to the founders or the CEO to invest more resources? And then it's up to you as a professional to figure out how to use those resources to hit your goals. But it's like, you need those resources. Like, is there anything you can say around, how to build that ask, right?
Yeah,
It's a big question, I know, but like,
it is a big question. Yeah, the challenge is it's just so different for every software company because it just really depends on what you're trying to do. I can, my general guidance though is that if you're talking to like a CEO, for instance, the nitty gritty tactical reasons to get X integration out the door aren't always going to be the right messaging, because they're thinking strategically, they're thinking broad vision, they're looking at what's happening in the market and things like that. And I think that's where this inner product experience concept relative to what's happening in the world, kind of a broader sweep of what the integration will do, is a helpful thing to be able to articulate. Like, why is it, you want to build an integration to this other technology over here. Why is that important for your customer? What is your customer doing that this adds value to them, and how do we capitalize on that value? And it may honestly be that we're not going to monetize this directly in any way, but we're going to create this experience for the customer that far and away exceeds what they can get elsewhere. And that's good for us in terms of stickiness, and it's good for us in sort of just a broader demand generation part of the business, because we can offer that.
That's a good point. Yeah. I mean, it's like building that journey. It's like different journeys. It's like, if we build this, here's the journey for our customer, and here's how it makes us stickier and more relevant, and all that stuff. That's not necessarily like there's 3,000 of these asks, which means this is how much revenue we're going to get by building this integration. Like, that seems like a simpler pitch, but a lot of the case, you just don't have that data. It's more or less on like, here's how people are using a software, and here's how having this integration is going to make that experience better. Like, do you think that's,
I think these are all layers of the same imperfect model you're trying to make, right? Because you never have perfect information. You want to have as much qualitative and as much quantitative information as you can, and then try to organize it in a way that you can make, using that nine box priority matrix, organize it in a way that you can make good decisions about it. And you're going to be wrong some amount of time, and you're going to be right some amount of the time. You just want to, sway that toward being right as much as you can.
Yeah, I was going to say, I personally talked to hundreds of different SaaS leaders about why they're wanting to spend money on an integration. And the number one, I would say, anecdotally, the number one reason is because their current customers want it. And maybe it's because I'm kind of more of a partnership guy and marketer, I always find that kind of a funny answer. Like, I guess that's one useful signal, but what about all the people that aren't using your software right now because they don't know about it, or because it doesn't have XYZ integration? Mm-hmm. Wouldn't that also be a good reason to build this? And it is largely forgotten. The other driver that we've seen again and again is one big customer wanting something. Either they committed to the software and they're going to leave if they don't get that built, or more likely the SaaS company is in the buying process and they're like, if you deliver this integration, then we'll go forward with X number of seats. And that's usually when we get the call, and it's like, hey, can you guys hurry up and build this so we can close this deal? And then we'll make it available to everybody, sure. But really it's about, one mega fish. And I don't think either of those, my personal opinion is I don't think either of those motivations for building integration is terribly healthy. But on the other hand, we all have to sell what we can to move our businesses forward. So it's not like we don't love to build those too. But I think it's really cool when people use strategic decision matrix like Ryan's presenting to actually think through the potential, the value that you can capture by building integration that you otherwise won't capture. Honestly, I don't see a lot of people thinking that way, though they ought to.
Yeah, it is so often a reactive decision to build an integration. And look, there are reasons you build an integration for one customer who demands it. If you're a startup and somebody's coming to you with a $10 million contract and they say, I need integration to SAP, you figure out a way to build integration to SAP. But those are rarer probably than you would expect in terms of a single customer or a very small number of customers asking for an integration and the reaction being, okay, we got to build that because we got to close this deal. You want to temper the reactive nature of this as much as possible. And the information coming in is great. helps validate the assumptions that you put together. It helps inform them further and all that kind of stuff. Helps even seed ideas for, hey, somebody asked about this thing. Maybe we should go pull on that thread a little bit and see if there's other customers who also want that thing. But I completely agree with you that it's not a particularly healthy way to think about things if you're just reacting to asks. That said, as you're building out your approach for how you do integrations too, you reduce the risk to being reactive if you have good technology to deploy them. You can deploy them quickly and inexpensively. You can, it's not as big of a deal if you do have to build an integration, because even if you do make even if you do give a yes answer to something that ultimately wasn't that great of a yes answer to give, if it costs you $5 and not $500, you're still in a better place.
Just being mindful of the time here, we got less than 10 minutes. So are there any other questions or pressing themes that anybody was hoping to get out of this? Let's throw another one on the table here before we're out of time. Is there anybody that has got anything?
Yeah, I'm also particularly interested if there's any, I know this was kind of an intentionally broad topic today, because I'm trying to get a feel for where everybody's at and what they're interested in. If there's any like more specific tactical things we can get into, I'm happy to do more of these in the future and try to have something a little more structured, a little bit more narrow focused.
Yeah. What about launching a partnership? What do you do in the first 60 days? Get the most out of it.
Launching an integration partnership specifically?
Yeah, you want to make as much money as possible. So how do you goose the gander here? How do you get your golden egg out of this?
Well, I'd ask how many companies are able to get the integration built in the first 60 days.
So what do you do? How do you project manage your partner? How do you get the most marketing wins?
Yeah. Where I found that to be successful is having a few, marketing around a potential integration and then having a few customers ready to go to basically build it on as like beta customers. There really is kind of a chicken and an egg scenario, right? Like we could talk about having the integration that we don't have to drum up the business, but if we don't have the integration, how do we serve it? I don't know that I have a magic bullet about that. I have to think about a good way to answer that question, but.
Yeah, if anybody has any question, put it in the comments too, because like Ryan said, we'd love to get this. I think this, quote unquote integration strategy or launching one or managing one is a whole series. Like there's so many different subtopics to this, and we want to address them one by one. If it's just literally how to build a team or how to work with an outside vendor, how to establish a relationship that works well. Any of these themes that you need an answer to, throw them in the comments or on Slack, and we'll get them answered kind of one by one. It's a complicated theme, and it's a complicated issue, and it's not something we can solve in an hour, but hopefully we get some ideas going and kind of go the next steps afterwards. But yeah, any other questions, folks? Yeah,
I had another question, kind of pertaining again to the revenue component, and then more specifically around the churn reducing part. Are there any best or any strategies that you use to kind of determine, or to put that into a formula, if you will, that, to figure out what the cost savings or the potential added revenue can be of having that stickier customer?
Mm-hmm. From a tactical perspective, you have to be able to build out an Excel model basically to literally do the math. I'd say it gets really hard if you don't have any data. Like you don't have real data to even if it's imperfect, but to suggest what's actually happening there. So, one of the things I focused on a lot in the past is discipline around like sales operations and customer experience teams using, or customer support teams using things like the CRM to track these things really, really effectively. So if you can correlate, churn to the absence of having an integration, things like that, and you've got some data to suggest why that is. Even if it's just when you're doing exit interviews for customers that are leaving, why are you leaving? And they're saying, because I need, this guy over here has the same exact product, but it integrates to this thing I need. You can start to actually categorize and catalog how much of what is happening there. You know, and it's never going to be all data driven, because it's impossible to have perfect data. And guess what? Salespeople don't ever put stuff in the CRM completely. But the extent you can use it is great. And then you just, again, sort of have to be able to line that up with your more qualitative, anecdotal understanding of what you're seeing happen around.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. But having some data points to go into the equation is definitely a good starting point for sure.
Yeah, I mean, whenever in ROI models, though, I'm telling you, the you get the biggest bang for the buck if you can tell a story about pulling forward SaaS revenue in some way, shape, or form by accelerating integrations out to the market, because that has such a compounding positive impact, because it's SaaS revenue or recurring revenue, that it's hard to compare that to like a cost savings ROI or a minimized churn ROI, because it's unbounded on the top side, and the numbers are just, they usually come out better that way. So if the priority one to figure out how to financially justify integrations should always be, how do we use this as a growth accelerator versus a cost saver or a revenue protector.
Got it. Thank you.
Anybody else? Last call for a pressing question. Otherwise, we're gonna wrap it up for today. Anybody? All right, sweet. Like I said, think about kind of what your 2021 looks like in this theme. Post it in the comments here, or on Slack, or message me directly, and we'll try to get some topics together in the first quarter next year and address these issues one by one. So thanks for joining me, Ryan. Thanks so much for the presentation and kind of facilitating the discussion. I think it was excellent. I think it opened up hopefully a Pandora's box to a lot more to come. But for now, thanks, and have a good holiday.
For more great insights on partnerships and software, like and subscribe, and we'll see you in the next video.